My name is Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska, and I'm the founder and director of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music here at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park. We're delighted that you're joining us for our final event of a wonderful spring 2024 semester and the end of our first full academic year of work. We're getting ready to head into our second summer term of graduate courses. Between this year and last, we fielded about 350 applications for our summer classes and are almost full in all of our 9 graduate courses as we near our May 1st application deadline for this summer. And our faculty is gearing up for classes to start on May 27th. We'll soon be able to announce all of the offerings of our 2024 to 2025 academic year aimed at providing musical, liturgical, and theological formation for the general public. Our fall and spring offerings will include a continuation of the series you're joining us for today, our public lecture and concert series, as well as a substantial array of diverse topics and faculty in our Monday evening workshops via Zoom, continuing education opportunities for our current graduate students, and several conferences. Having hosted our first conference back in November 2023, honoring the life and work of Dr. William Mart, who I see is joining us today, we'll continue to expand our conference offerings. In October of 2024, we'll host a conference on Gregorian chant in Catholic education, as well as the return of Sacra Liturgia in July 2025. Last Saturday, we hosted 110 singers for our what we hope will be an annual event called Sacred Music Study Day. And it was an opportunity for singers in the area to come together, music directors with their singers here locally, and we offered them coaching in group vocal technique, the opportunity to learn and to sing pneumatic notation, to sight sing in the chant modes, and to learn a new chant ordinary, as well as a couple of motets and hymns and other sacred music that we can sing together at archdiocesan events and in our parishes. We pray daily for the renewal of sacred music in the life of the Church and long to see the graces that flow from dignified and beautiful worship of God manifested in the hearts of all. We're grateful for the presence of each of you here today, knowing as we do that many of you are likewise laboring in your corners of the vineyard to bring about a rich harvest. Thanks to the work of so many, Gregorian chant and the treasury of sacred music are heard not only in monasteries, but in parishes and schools all over as a new generation of those who love the Church's treasury of sacred melodies discovers their Catholic birthright in this rich repertoire and strives to sing it with beauty and excellence for the glory of God and the sanctification of all those who hear them. In the midst of God's benediction upon this renewal of sacred music, we recognize that there's always a vital role played by monasteries in the preservation of Catholic teaching and tradition. They are a vital locus where the Church's liturgical rites and calendar can be lived in their fullness, firstly for the monks, of course, but also for all visitors who walk through their doors to go to Mass or attend Vespers. The Church's truest sense of progressive solemnity in the ebb and flow of different melodies for the same texts on different feasts and seasons, the experience of the fully sung liturgy day after day and hour after hour, weaving together a liturgical cosmos in which God abides, the sanctification of time and space by the rhythm of the monk's daily life and prayer. This is truly a treasure for all the Church, bringing about the saving graces for all of mankind. For me, the richness of this monastic tradition has been especially powerful and transformative in Norcia, the birthplace of St. Benedict and Scholastica. St. Benedict, of course, the founder of Western monasticism. And so we're delighted to be joined this morning by a truly treasured laborer in the Lord's vineyard, Father Cassian Folsom, founder of the Benedictine monastery in Norcia, first in Rome and now up the hill from Norcia at San Benedetto in Monte. The community is celebrating its 25th anniversary, and it's robust and growing and will soon be dedicating its newly rebuilt monastery, just shortly after having opened a beautiful guest house this past fall. The community there is marked by their singing of the chant, having let the world have a moment in their chapel in the recording of a chart-topping CD of Marian chant in 2015. And that love of the chant is something handed on to them by their musician and scholar founder, and prior emeritus who joins us today, Born in Lynn, Massachusetts in 1955, Father Cassian studied music before joining the monastic community of St. Meinrad in 1974. He serves on the faculty of the Pontifical Athenaeum of San Anselmo in Rome, where he is currently on sabbatical, writing a book about books, and taking time out of his busy schedule of advising theses and dissertations today to talk to us about the history of the Graduale Romanum. Please join me in welcoming Father Cassian Folsom.
Thank you all very much. I'm not computer literate, and so I'm hoping that this will go well this evening. In my time, it's morning your time. So pray that there are no demons in my computer. The topic is the Graduale Romanum, which is a controversial document. To understand better the nature of that controversy, I'd like to look back in history to the different stages of development of this liturgical book. The basic issue is this. There's a tension between two opposing points of view. First, the restoration of the ancient chant tradition, and secondly, the adaptation to modern styles of liturgical music. As we go through the different stages of the history of the Gradual, keep these two approaches in mind. It will be a kind of red thread that unites very different time periods. I realize that my description of this dichotomy is somewhat oversimplified, but it would take more time to go into all the details, and we don't have that time this evening. So I'd like to present 6 books containing chants for the Mass. Chants for the Divine Office is an entirely different story. The 6 books are, first of all, the Medicea Gradual of 1614 and 1615, that is the post-Tridentan Gradual. Secondly, the Liber Usualis of 1896. Then the Graduale Romanum of 1908. Fourth, the Graduale Simplex of 1965 and the Graduale Simplex of 1967. These books are simpliges with simpler melodies. Next, the Graduale Romanum of 1974, together with the Graduale Triplex of 79. And finally, the Graduale Novum in 2 volumes, 2011 and 2018. We have only 45 minutes, so I'll devote about 5 minutes to each book. Of its very nature, then, this conference is merely an initial presentation or synthesis, because each book really deserves a more detailed study. According to European historiography, the modern period begins with 1497, or 1492, the discovery of the New World. So we're starting our survey with post-Tridentan graduals. So all the books we're talking about are modern. What about the centuries before Trent? Before we jump into the modern period, therefore, I'd like to give a brief historical sketch of what we should talk about if we have the time to do so. First of all, typology. What type of book is this, the Gradual? Well, in 8th century Rome, there were 3 books for the music. That is the Cantatorium for solo cantors who sang the Gradual and more difficult chants. Secondly, the Responsoriale for the offertory chant, which originally had the form of a responsory, and the only remnant left for that particular form today is the offertory of the Requiem Mass. And thirdly, the Antiphonarium, which contained the chants for the introit and communion, along with their respective psalm verses. North of the Alps, however, as Amalarius tells us, these books were combined into one with the terminology antiphonarium or antiphonale. Another aspect of the question of typology is, who is this book for? The book is for the cantors, both solo cantors and the Schola Cantorum as a group. It's not a book for the participation of the people. That's an anachronistic concept for the 9th and 10th centuries when this book develops. That doesn't mean that the congregation wasn't involved, but in a sung mass, before printing was invented, before people had books, the people had no worship aids, as we call them today. They simply sang the dialogue between the priest and the people. Dominus vobiscum et cum spiritu tuo, the Amen, the preface dialogue, and so forth. Perhaps they also sang the simpler, ordinary parts of the Mass, but that's not entirely clear. The Schola, the larger group of cantors, sang the ordinary of the Mass, the Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Agnus Dei, ite missa est, and the simpler chants of the proper, while the more proficient cantors sang the more difficult chants of the proper, that is, the gradual, the Alleluia or tract, and the offertory. In its origin, the written music was simply to jog the memory of the cantors because the entire repertoire was memorized. The chant was an oral tradition before it became a written tradition. All this is to say that the book is for the cantors, and therefore it's a small book of modest dimensions. We won't talk about the huge chorali, the books placed on a stand for the entire side of choir to look at. That's another question. Another topic that would be interesting to explore is the difference between Old Roman chant and what we call Gregorian chant. There are scholarly debates about this question, but the commonly held conclusion is that the Roman chant, when it found its way north of the Alps into the Frankish kingdom, merged with Gallican chant to form a new musical style. The name Gregorian was given to this synthesis because of the Gallican reverence for all things Roman, and because the name of St. Gregory carried with it a kind of moral authority. If we were to give a more complete picture, we would talk about simple books and composite books. This is a distinction made by the chant scholar Michel Huglot. Simple books contain one liturgical book only, such as an antiphonarium or a cantatorium, or a Liber Gradualis, or processionale, etc. Composite books, on the other hand, are found in various combinations, such as the gradual bound together with the sacramentary, or a gradual lectionary, or a book with tropes along with sequences, or a gradual fused with other books of the Mass. The variety is endless. As part of our introduction, we should look at the evolution of this liturgical book. The earliest evidence we have, which comes from the 8th and 9th centuries, contains the text only, since the melodies were part of the oral tradition. Bit by bit, there developed a system of musical notation. We are most familiar with the neumes reproduced in the Graduale Triplex, first without a musical staff, then with one line, then with two, and then with four. The square notation we're familiar with is a development of the 13th century. But all this is the subject of musical paleography. Alberto Turco, who was a professor at the Pontifical Institute of Musica Sacra, distinguishes four historical periods of chant development. The first he calls the classical period, from the 5th to the 8th centuries, in which the Roman chant developed. There are other non-Roman chant families, of course, corresponding to the various non-Roman liturgical families, the most famous of which is the chant from Benevento. In the 8th century, as indicated, the Roman chant encountered Gallican chant and a new synthesis was formed. The second period, Turco calls post-classical, from the 9th to the 12th century, in which we see the development of chant notation, the rise of new musical forms such as polyphony and measured music, with a corresponding decline of Gregorian chant. In this period, we also have the development of modern tonalities, that is major and minor, as opposed to the 8 Gregorian modes. Now, the development of these modes and their relationship to the Byzantine Oktoikos is another area to be studied, which we won't go into now. The third period, according to Turco, is one of decadence and includes the printed missals before 1614, the famous Medicea edition, which we'll talk about in a moment, and the period all the way up to the late 1800s. Finally, the fourth period, he calls that of restoration, which begins with the founding of the monastery of Solesmes in 1833, and the subsequent specialization of the monks in musical paleography and the restoration of ancient chant melodies based upon manuscript evidence. So that's a thumbnail sketch of background material, which allows us to begin our study of the 6 books mentioned, starting with the Medicea Graduale of 1614 and 1615. It would seem that the first printed gradual came out in 1499 or 1500, printed by Giunta in Venice. In recent years, considerable research has been done on the subject of early printed graduals. There must have been considerable demand because between 1499 and 1650, some 40 editions of the gradual were printed by various publishing houses. From the mid-17th century, however, the frequency of such publications seems to have declined. Nevertheless, it's important to note that the period from Trent to Pius X is not simply a lull in the action. On the contrary, according to time and place, it was a period of intense activity. The Medicea edition is to be understood in this context. Given the state of the church music at this time, it is understandable that there were various currents for reform. There were 2 basic schools of thought: those who wanted to return to the best musical traditions of the past, and those who proposed a general revision of the chant melodies so as to make them conform to the musical tastes of the time. Barofio provides a fascinating account of the formation of the 1614-1615 edition of the Roman Gradual, the so-called Medici edition. The first attempt at creating this gradual was made by Gregory XIII in October 1577, when he entrusted the revision of the music books of the liturgy, that is, the gradual for Mass, and the antiphonary and psalter for the office. He entrusted these things to a friend of yours, Pierluigi da Palestrina and Annibale Zoilo. However, there was immediate controversy based on fear of change. In fact, the Spanish ambassador to the Holy See, Ferdinando de las Infantas, wrote to King Philip II of Spain, asking him to intervene with the Pope. The result was the suspension of the work begun by Palestrina and Zoilo. Years passed. Zoilo died in 1592, Palestrina in 1594. The project was finished by Iginio, the son of Palestrina, who sold everything to the printers Valesio and Parasoli. However, payment was not forthcoming, so Iginio sued the printers, and the matter was tied up in the courts from 1596 to 1602. A second attempt to publish the gradual was made by Pope Paul V, who established a new commission of cardinals in 1608. In 1611, 2 musicians were appointed as consultors, Felice Anerio and Francisco Soriano. By 1612, the gradual was ready to go to the printer. But once again, there was strong opposition and the intervention of King Philip III of Spain. Nonetheless, Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, president of the commission, approved the gradual in 1612, but as a result of the controversy, it was assigned a lower level of authority. The authorization given was superiorum permissu, which indicates that the book was not an official edition, but a private initiative. The printer, Raimondi, began the process of printing 1,000 copies of the Graduale de Tempore, but died in February 1614. The second volume was printed the following year, in 1650. While the original attempt to reform the Gradual was in the line of the traditional school, the second attempt was an adaptation to the musical tastes of the age. In respect to the tradition, this edition contained severely modified melodies. For example, there was a progressive reduction of repeated notes on the same pitch from 3 to 2, and finally to 1, and the contraction of melismatic passages, omitting whole musical phrases. Because it was not official or obligatory, much diversity remained. Nevertheless, the Medicea Gradual had an important impact on the liturgy of the Church. Many churches, especially in Italy, bought copies, and it remained in use in some places until the 1900s. In the period between this 1614 Gradual and the 20th century, new Gregorian melodies were composed, including the popular Missa de Angelis in a modern tonality, and the simple tones of the Marian antiphons, including the Salve Regina. These simpler compositions had an enormous and universal success, but the state of the chant remained precarious. Purco goes so far as to call the Medicea edition monstrous, and adds that with this edition, Gregorian chant could be considered dead and buried. The second book we want to look at is the Liber Usualis of 1896. In that year, the Abbey of Solesmes, in the person of Dom André Moquereau, a famous chant specialist, came out with the Liber Usualis Missae et Officii, a handy book containing in one volume all the chants needed for an ordinary parish for Sundays and feast days throughout the year. There was a second edition in 1903. The intention was truly pastoral, providing detailed instructions for the non-specialist, so that a moderately trained schola could sing the chants for a parish liturgy. There was another edition in 1924, augmented and reprinted several times, and yet another published in 1962, in order to include the changes based on the 1960 Codex Rubricarum, especially concerning the ranking of feasts. Between 1924 and 1962, there were many other editions. A 1956 edition, for example, was intended for the English-speaking world with an expanded introduction and rubrics in English. At the parish level, the Liber Usualis was better known than the Graduale. In addition to the Mass chants for Sundays and feast days, the Liber also contains the respective chants for the Divine Office. We should recall that in many places, it was the custom for the faithful to participate not only in the Sunday Mass, but also Sunday Vespers. Pope Pius XII, in Mediator Dei, lamented that this practice had fallen out of use and warmly urged a recovery of Sunday Vespers in parishes. The third book we want to look at is the Graduale Romanum of 1908. In the 19th century, there were efforts both in France and Germany to produce a better edition of the Gradual than the Medicea edition. The diocesan priests Alix and Bonhomme printed the Reims-Cambrai edition in 1851 to 1855. Another edition of the Graduale Romanum by the Jesuit Lambiot was published posthumously in 1857, and in 1863, yet another by the German Michael Hermesdorf. At this point, we can speak about the work of Solesmes. The Abbey of Solesmes, founded in 1833 by Dom Prosper Guéranger, soon became known for its pioneering work in the study of chant manuscripts, founding the scholarly review Paléographie Musicale. Michel Huglot gives a good summary of this work pertaining to the gradual in particular, which should be supplemented by the book-length study of Pierre Combe. In 1883, an improved gradual was prepared by Dom Joseph Potier, based upon a manuscript of Montpellier and other manuscripts of Aquitaine. As one might expect, the Solemn Liber Gradualis of 1883 provoked considerable controversy since it was a radical departure from the Medicea edition. The 83 edition was again updated in 1895. When Pope Pius X, in the first months of his pontificate, issued the motu proprio on church music, Tra le sollecitudini, the monks of Solesmes were well positioned to respond to the need. In April of 1904, Pius X ordered an official edition of the chant books for the liturgy. The commission Pius X established was marked by the same tension I mentioned earlier between two schools of thought. One which wanted to restore the melodies to their ancient form, the other which wanted the adaptation of those melodies which had occurred over the centuries so as not to create a rupture with the living tradition. The solution to the impasse was simply to use the 1895 edition. There was a Kyriale that appeared in 1905 and the Graduale 3 years later in 1908. This gradual was based on the 1895 edition with some changes and improvements based on the witness of other chant manuscripts. An anecdote from the oral tradition has it that after the publication of Tra le sollecitudini, Pope Pius X asked the monks of Solesmes how long it would take to publish the gradual. After some reflection, the answer came back, about 50 years, at which the Pope responded, well, I'll give you 5. In fact, the calculations of the monks were accurate. It took until 1948 to publish a new critical edition of the gradual based upon a careful examination of over 700 manuscripts, all of which were cataloged, and the catalog itself was published in 1957. Now I'm going to jump to the fourth set of books, the Graduale Simplex and the Graduale Simplex of the early post-conciliar years. A reference to the Vatican II document on sacred liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, is necessary at this point in order to understand the background of the Graduale Simplex of 65 and the Graduale Simplex of 67. A comprehensive study would include an investigation of the Pian reforms, the commission under Pius XII, and the document Musicam Sacram of 1958. It would also include references to the gradual in the discussions of the preparatory commission to the council, which prepared the various drafts of Sacrosanctum Concilium. We will make use of the very helpful tool compiled by Francisco Gil Helin, presenting the 4 drafts of the council text on the liturgy, along with supporting documentation. Only 2 paragraphs of Sacrosanctum Concilium concern us here. First of all, paragraph 116, which says, the Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as proper to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, and of course they never are, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. But other kinds of sacred music, especially polyphony, are by no means excluded from liturgical celebrations, so long as they accord with the spirit of the liturgical action as laid down in Article 30. The second paragraph that interests us is the following one, 170, which says, the typical edition of the books of Gregorian chant is to be completed, and a more critical edition is to be prepared of those books already published since the restoration by Pius X. It's also desirable that an edition be prepared containing simpler melodies for use in small churches. Here's my comment on these two paragraphs. Sacrosanctum Concilium 116 is a text of studied ambiguity, reflecting the sharp disagreements of two different schools of thought, the same two that we've seen in all of these other editions. That is, one school which wanted to preserve, promote, and increase the treasury of sacred music, which required competent musicians. The other school, which was focused on promoting active participation, understood to be the assembly singing acclamations, responses, psalmody, antiphons, and songs. The attempt to maintain a creative tension between these two points of view was ultimately unsuccessful. These disagreements will have their impact on the post-Vatican II liturgical books of chant. The paragraph 117 is more specifically concerned with the books themselves. The text can be better understood by referring to the declaratio, which accompanied the first draft of the council document. These explanations, or declarationes, were added to the schema by the Conciliar Commission for the sake of greater clarity. The declaratio to 117 reads, "The work of restoration of sacred chant begun by St. Pius X 60 years ago still remains unfinished. Up to this point, the books published are the Kyriale of 1905, the Graduale 1907-1908, the Office of the Dead 1909, the Cantorinus or Common Tones 1912, the Antiphonale Romanum for the Day Hours 1912, the Office of Holy Week 1922 and 1955, the Office of Christmas 1926, and the Pontificale Romanum of 1961. What is still missing, the Declaratio says, is the Book of Responsories or the Matitunarium. In addition, the Declaratio continues, the Vatican edition required for liturgical use so quickly by St. Pius X, now, with the remarkable progress in the paleographical disciplines, is found to be faulty in many ways. And all the experts hope that the Vatican edition will be amended in the future with the help of a critical edition, which for the Gradual has been ready by Solesmes for a decade and more. Finally, the desire is expressed that a simpler edition be prepared for small churches. The present edition of the Kyriale, arranged in its present form in 1905, contains 18 complete sets of the ordinary of the Mass and a few other options for individual chants, such as the Kyrie, Gloria, and so on. Many of these sets, since they are endowed with richer and more ornate melodies, are more fitting for well-trained scholae cantorum rather than for the body of the faithful or for small parish scholae. What is said of the Kyriale is requested also for the chant of the proper of the Mass, namely that formularies should be prepared which are easier both in terms of melody and of text, which can be sung and adapted to diverse circumstances, so that even smaller scholae cantorum, such as are in parishes, can sing them. Pope Benedict XIII already did something similar for rituals in his booklet Memoriale Rituum, designed for small churches. All of that was a citation from the Declarationes. The final draft of paragraph 117 is rather synthetic, but presumes this declaratio. The important themes that emerge are these. First of all, the completion of the chant books for matins, which never happened, of course, because the Reformed Liturgia Horarum had a completely different arrangement. Secondly, the importance of a more critical edition of the Graduale Romanum. And third, the need for a Kyriale Simplex. And fourth, the desire for a Graduale Simplex. The Kyriale Simplex of 1965 was prepared almost immediately by the Concilium ad Exequendam and approved by the Congregation of Rites. It's a pamphlet of 48 pages with a soft cover meant for easy distribution and normal parish use, containing not only the simpler chants from the 1905 Kyriale, but also some easy melodies from the Ambrosian and Spanish traditions. It was a valiant attempt, but it never got off the ground. The 1967 instruction Musicam Sacram, signed both by Concilium and the Congregation of Rites, attempted to chart a course between the Schiller and Charybdis of debates about liturgical music, but that involves questiones disputate beyond the scope of this conference. The Graduale Simplex of 1967 takes as a model the antiphons from the divine office, since they are often simpler melodies designed to be sung by untrained voices. The result, in my opinion, is a pedantic and uninspiring collection without the élan of the traditional mass chants. An Editio Typica Altera was published in 1975 to correspond with the 1970 Missal of Paul VI, the new calendar, the new Ordo Cantus Missae, and the Nova Vulgata of the Psalms. In this 1975 edition, the Kyriale Simplex and the Graduale Simplex are combined. This book is still available, of course. Now we pass to the fifth book, the Graduale Romanum of 1974, together with the Graduale Triplex of 79. To be precise, the Graduale Romanum of 74 is not an official edition of the Vatican, but a private initiative of Solesmes. That's the result of compromise, of course. Due to the many changes in the Mass, the Gradual was restructured to correspond to the Missale Romanum of 1970 and the Ordo Cantus Missae of 1972, but the chant melodies remained intact. The strong push for extended use of the vernacular made the use of chant books in Latin a rather moot point. In 1979, the Graduale Triplex was published by Solesmes, a judicious compromise in that the traditional chant melodies were retained, and the more critical aspect, consisting of the neumes of three principal manuscripts, were written in above and below the line of square notation. In this way, those trained in these matters would be able to interpret the traditional melodies based upon the more ancient neumes. The sixth and last book is the Graduale Novum in 2 volumes, 2011 and 2018. The approach of the Graduale Triplex was taken to its logical conclusion by the 2011 Graduale Novum, an initiative of the International Society for the Study of Gregorian Chant, in which the melodies of the 1908 Gradual were modified to correspond to the more ancient neumes without musical staff from manuscripts of the 11th century. The editors admit that the appearance of the melodies will strike the casual reader as unfamiliar, not to say strange, in the present edition, in the case of a few chants. Conclusion. In the Missale Romanum of 1970, there were radical changes in the euchology, that is, the orations, the Ordo Missae, and the readings. For the chants, however, there has been a basic change of structure to correspond to the Ordo Cantus Missae of 72, but the Graduale Romanum of 74 maintains the traditional chant melodies. This book, therefore, in comparison with other components of the Roman Missal, shows the greatest continuity with the tradition.
I am busy, I'm sorry.
No, can we leave what we have to say?
Pardon?
Go ahead, Father.
I was saying that the Gradual shows the greatest continuity with the tradition. However, the Gradual does not have the authority of an Editio Typica and remains a private initiative. It's unknown to the vast majority of Catholics, and used by a very small minority, a few monasteries or religious communities, a few cathedral or parish churches. The use of the vernacular languages has meant new compositions for Mass in these languages, both in terms of text and music, which may or not be moored to the tradition. The larger question is the relationship between active participation and the artistic quality of sacred music. In conclusion, we return to our observation at the beginning of this conference, namely that in moments of reform, there has always been a tension between two opposing points of view. On the one hand, the restoration of the ancient chant tradition, the desire to be authentic, and on the other hand, adaptation to other styles of liturgical music. This second category of adaptation includes polyphony and the hymn tradition, which in some countries is rich and highly developed. But it also includes new compositions whose texts are of dubious value and whose melodies and rhythms are inspired by popular culture. Therefore, the tension remains. How can this be overcome? Well, there are a number of possible responses. First of all, one can resolve the tension by stressing the chant. There are some, rather few centers where the classical Roman rite is celebrated using the entire chant repertoire. Or secondly, one can resolve the tension by stressing modern music. This approach tends to exclude not only the chant, but also polyphony. Although the presupposition is that the congregation should sing everything, many modern compositions rely heavily on the choir or on solo singers. The exclusive use of this new liturgical music is the solution to the tension which has been generally adopted in most places. But there's a third solution, that is to live with this tension. The Catholic solution is usually et, both this and that, instead of out, either this or that. One can use both chant and polyphony, both chant and hymnody, both ancient chant and new compositions. The criteria listed by Pius X in 1903 for liturgical music remains valid today. That is, these new compositions must be sacred, artistically beautiful, and universal. For this Catholic solution to happen, a new or renewed understanding of the Eucharistic liturgy is required. That is, the liturgy is not didactic, but is ordered by its very nature to worship. It's not only intellectual, but also intuitive. It's not only prose, but also poetry. The use of the Graduale Romanum is a way to rediscover the poetic dimension of the liturgy. The beauty of the chant raises the heart to God. This is our spiritual patrimony, which must not be squandered away. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Father.